This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in the video. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author, and storytelling madman Eric Malachite. And today's video was a team effort between writer Larry Holsworth and editor Karl Smallwood. So be sure to show them both some love in the comments as you deploy your likes. Subscribe to the channel and ring that bell if you haven't, and check out our new sister channel, About Us, which talks about the history of businesses. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, go ahead and click the link in the description or pinned comment and watch the videos we've already got up there for you. Let's get to it. In 1976, a new American made-for-television film aired for the first time, introducing a World War II-based series titled Baa Black Sheep. It purported to tell the story of a U.S. Marine fighter squadron that served in the Solomon Islands campaign in the Pacific Theater, and was based on the autobiographical book of the same name, written by the squadron's former commander, U.S. Marine Major Greg Pappy Boyington. The series featured Robert Conrad, whose most famous role up to that time had been of James West in the series The Wild Wild West, which was a TV show before it was a terrible Will Smith movie. The real Boyington, then still alive, served as a technical consultant and later appeared in a cameo role as a general in 3 episodes of the program, which eventually was retitled Black Sheep Squadron and ran for a total of 36 episodes. Critics were not kind. The Washington Post noted that it was seemingly aimed exclusively at those who remembered the war as a rousing, blousy fraternity turkey shoot. The program relied on long-established Hollywood cliches, even by the standards of the 70s. The premise was that the eponymous Black Sheep alluded to by the title were a ragtag group of fighter pilots contemptuous of military regulations and discipline, who each episode managed to escape the wrath of their superiors by the skin of their teeth due to the enormity of their red, white, and blue balls. The pilots of the Black Sheep Squadron were hard-drinking, two-fisted all-American boys, constantly at odds against the military establishment as they battled bad weather and chronic shortages of parts for their airplanes, food, and female companionship. The only thing they had a lot of were Japanese pilots trying to kill them. Against these, they invariably prevailed conveniently before the end of each episode and thus escaped any disciplinary action for their indiscretions and gaining the adulation of the press and public. Even Boyington referred to the series as Hollywood hokum. The true story of Boyington and his World War II exploits was obscured by Conrad's version, which was and remains a travesty. The real Boyington, whose career was remarkable, served in the U.S. Army before World War II, resigned his commission to join the Flying Tigers fighting the Japanese in China, changed his legal identity to enlist in the Marine Corps in 1942, and was eventually shot down by the Japanese, captured, and spent more than a year in Japanese prisoner of war camps. He was one of the first American flying aces of the war, eventually shot down more than 24 enemy airplanes and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his performance. After the war, though, he could barely hold down a job. This is the true story of Gregory Boyington, nicknamed Pappy by the much younger pilots who served under him. It first appeared in his autobiographical memoir, was greatly fictionalized by television, and has only recently been more accurately documented by historians and aviation buffs. As is so often the case, the truth is greater than fiction. As Life magazine wrote in 1945, following his repatriation as a former POW, Boyington was born to be a swashbuckler. If you want your business to be as legendary as the folks who contributed to the war effort in World War II, then you're going to need an awesome website. And the sponsor for today's video, Squarespace, has you covered. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform, perfect for entrepreneurs with wares to sell, bloggers with a message to spread, soldiers looking to take on the Third Reich, and artists looking to reach the masses with their work. Whether you're just starting out or you're looking for a way to better manage your brand, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create beautiful professional websites, engage with your audience, and make sure the right people are getting your message. Squarespace's Fluid Engine makes it easier than ever for pretty much anyone to dive in and make a beautiful website. Answer a few questions about the goals you'd like to accomplish with your site, choose a template, and get dragging and dropping elements onto your template. Drag and drop technology is also included in every Squarespace site. And now, introducing Design Intelligence, Squarespace's brand new service that combines 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise with cutting-edge AI technology to unlock your your strongest creative potential. Design intelligence empowers anyone to build a beautiful, more personalized website tailored to their unique needs and craft a bespoke digital identity to use across one's entire online presence. Best of all, if you're selling stuff on your website, you'll be able to offer a simple yet seamless checkout experience with Squarespace's powerful tools. You'll be able to accept credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, offer customers the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to the video. Greg Boyington grew up under another name. His biological father was a dentist named Charles Boyington, who married Grace Gregory in January 1912. Their son, Greg, was born in December of that year. By then, the marriage was already in trouble, the couple dysfunctional, with alcohol and infidelity on the part of both parents present. Shortly after Greg's birth, a fire destroyed the hospital where he had entered the world, also destroying his birth certificate. Charles abandoned the family when Greg was just 3 months old, and a year later, his mother obtained a divorce. In the spring of 1915, Grace began residing with Ellsworth Hollenbeck, though whether it was through a legal marriage remains a subject of debate. They settled in a small lumber community near Coeur d'Alene in Idaho, where Ellsworth worked as a bookkeeper. Young Greg grew up believing his last name to be Hollenbeck. Ellsworth proved to be as heavy a drinker as had Charles before him, prone to domestic violence and emotional abuse, and dismissive of his role as a stepfather. The family moved frequently, often because rent money had vanished into barroom tills or liquor stores. Later in life, Boyington found he had few fond memories of his childhood, at least as far as his domestic life was concerned. He did reminisce with some happiness over his Idaho boyhood away from the home where he enjoyed the outdoors, particularly climbing the steep wooded hills. He was an average student in school and an avid consumer of news, particularly war news, as Europe convulsed itself in what was then called the Great War, later rebranded as World War I when, the second one happened. He was particularly enamored with the tales of a new type of warrior, the fighter pilot. He listened to the exploits of the heroes of the sky, the Red Baron, the Allied ace Raoul Lufberry, the tales of the American Lafayette Escadrille, and later those of American heroes such as Eddie Rickenbacker. Following the war, barnstorming pilots toured the United States, giving demonstrations, presenting air shows, and offering rides to those interested. In September of 1919, one such aviation daredevil, Clyde Pangborn, provided the young Greg Hollenbeck his first ride in an airplane in return for $5. Where Greg got the money remains unknown. He later told different stories of how he obtained it. He had by then already decided upon a career in the military. From then on, he dreamed of becoming a military flyer. In high school, Greg came into his own both academically and athletically. He maintained above-average grades in his studies, lettered in wrestling, excelled in swimming, and proved popular with fellow students, an achievement which had up to then eluded him. Following high school, he entered the University of Washington at Seattle. Then, outside the dysfunctional home, he continued to do well, joining the Army Reserve Officer Training Corps, or ROTC, and concentrating his studies on architecture. Though he lacked a scholarship, he was invited to join the wrestling team at his coach's request. He also visited the nearby Boeing Aircraft Company's factory, where he admired the new designs of airplanes being produced. The visit inspired him to change his major from architecture to aeronautical engineering. In 1933, he attended an ROTC dance, where he met a young woman named Helene Clark. They were married in July 1934. The following May, Helene gave birth to their first son. Gregory Hollenbeck Jr., Greg Sr., had graduated the preceding January, and with a family to support, he went to work at Boeing as a draftsman, reviewing airplane drawings and dreaming of flying. He couldn't afford a plane, though, not even regular access to one, but he could at least work near them. Greg's ROTC membership obligated him to a period of active duty upon graduation with the United States Army Reserve. He fulfilled that obligation by serving in the artillery at coastal fortifications around the Puget Sound. The artillery was not to his taste, and upon completion of his mandatory service, he entered the inactive reserves. In April 1935, he learned of the recent passage of the Aviation Cadet Act by Congress, which offered qualified candidates a year of flight training for service in the United States Navy or Marine Corps. There was a problem, though. The Navy would not accept married men as candidates, and since the Marine Corps was under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of the Navy, neither would they. And it was around this time that Greg learned, possibly through his mother, that his real name was Gregory Boyington, not Gregory Hollenbeck. In an early example of his tendency to exploit legal loopholes to advance his own interests, he realized that according to existing documentation, Gregory Hollenbeck was married, but Gregory Boyington was not. Nor was there any legal paper establishing Gregory Boyington as a father. Accordingly, it was Gregory Boyington who applied for entrance into the Marine Corps as part of the aviation training program. He was accepted and embarked upon a period of deception, keeping his wife and family a secret from the Marine Corps. The deception caused financial hardship for Boyington. He was forced to house his family at his own expense off base, while at the same time keeping up appearances as a young single pilot trainee while living on base. Officers at the time paid for their own meals, including while aboard a ship, and also paid for the upkeep and maintenance of their own uniforms. He was eager to display the behavior of a young single pilot cadet, both in his early training in Washington and later during advanced training in Florida. In essence, living a double life, Boyington rapidly ran up significant debts. We can't imagine things were easy at home for Hollenbeck either. Boyington struggled with ground school and theoretical training, though he excelled in flight. In 1937, he was awarded his wings as an aviator. He had by then developed the reputation of being an excellent and skilled pilot. He was also considered to be somewhat of a slouch at paperwork, contemptuous of the spit and polish tradition of the Marine Corps, and an enthusiastic consumer of whiskey, both in on-base clubs and off-base watering holes. You and me both, buddy. His next assignment was in Quantico, Virginia, and he moved Helene and his son, soon to be joined by a daughter, to Virginia, again at his own expense. The double life continued to generate financial difficulties, and his frequent absences put additional strain on the marriage. Soon, Helene was drinking excessively as well. In 1940, another daughter was added to the clan. Debts continued to mount. Meanwhile, the rest of the world went to war due to German aggression in Europe and Japanese aggression in China. That same year, the United States was officially neutral, even as the US government adopted ever more open policies supporting the Allies in Europe and aimed at controlling Japanese expansion in the Pacific. By 1941, Boyington's marital status was known to his superiors in the Marine Corps, though officially the circumstances of his deception were ignored. Also known to the Corps was his massive debt. When creditors contacted the Marine demanding action, his pay was taken over by the Corps, which allotted most of his salary toward reducing his debt, leaving little to support his family. Then a new program emerged which offered the potential for some relief. It was in the form of yet another idea from the mind of Franklin Roosevelt, which afforded the United States an opportunity to improve its military readiness, offer aid to allies, and still present an appearance of complete neutrality. It was called the American Volunteer Group, or AVG. Boyington had returned to Pensacola as a flight instructor when that facility was visited by representatives of the AVG in 1941. At the time, he was under the threat of a court-martial for having been involved in a fistfight. That charge, as well as his history of massive debt, threatened his career with a dishonorable end. The AVG offered a solution to all his pressing difficulties. AVG pilots would be recruited to serve as paid civilian volunteers fighting the Japanese in China. They would receive the princely sum of $500 per month, which is about $10,000 today, and more than double what was Boyington's pay as a Marine. In addition, another $500 would be paid for each Japanese aircraft destroyed by a pilot. The pilots would technically be civilian contractors, outside the jurisdiction of the American military and not subject to its regulations. In order to meet that requirement, military aviators were required to resign their commissions, though it was with the understanding that they would be reinstated without penalty at a later date, upon their request. In reality, the AVG was a quasi-military organization funded by the US government, operated by former senior military officers, and intended to both support the Chinese fighting Japan and acquire valuable combat experience for American pilots. They were provided with one of the newest and most capable combat aircraft available in the American inventory, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. They were to be commanded by Claire Chennault, already a legend in American military aviation. Boyington jumped at what must have been seen by him as nearly divine intervention. In 1941, he resigned from the Marine Corps, joined the AVG, and made the journey to China via ship across the vast Pacific. In theater, he quickly developed a reputation of being a drunk with an exaggerated opinion of his own abilities as a leader and as a pilot. Chennault supported that assessment, though Boyington's flying abilities were unquestioned. The men painted shark's teeth on the noses of their P-40s, an image which originated with British pilots operating the airplane in North Africa. When members of the press saw the airplanes, they dubbed them the Flying Tigers. Contrary to popular belief, the Flying Tigers did not begin operations against the Japanese prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Boyington and his new colleagues did not fight the Japanese until early 1942, attempting to stem the enemy's invasion of Southeast Asia and Burma. During his brief tenure with the unit, Boyington claimed to have destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft, a figure which was later accepted by the Marine Corps. AVG records credited him with 2, and possibly another 2 destroyed on the ground. The entry of the United States into the war caused Boyington to reconsider his status. In April 1942, he abandoned his contract with the AVG and returned to the United States, paying for the then perilous journey with his own funds. Upon arrival, he presented himself to the Marine Corps with a request for a return to service. His troubled marriage ended in divorce as he prepared to return to active duty, with Boyington charging the mother of his children with neglect. His 3 children were sent to live with their grandmother while extended duty overseas beckoned for their father. Despite his checkered past, the Marines needed aviators, particularly those with combat experience against the Japanese. On September 29, 1942, Boyington was commissioned and assigned to serve as the executive officer, or second in command, of a fighter group then serving on the embattled island of Guadalcanal. Boyington returned to combat operations on Guadalcanal in early 1943. Marine fighter aircraft operations at the time were primarily focused on providing close air support to ground troops and attacking Japanese ships in and around the islands. By August 1943, he was in command of another Marine fighter squadron at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, though through that period he was not credited with destroying any Japanese aircraft. In September, Boyington was ordered to report to the island of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides Island Group to assume command of 27 pilots in the then untested combat squadron designated VMF-214, VMF being the designation for Marine Fighter Squadron. The group had recently been formed in Hawaii and were known by the nickname Swashbucklers. Under Boyington, the squadron adopted the nickname of Black Sheep. Unlike the legend which arose surrounding them, they were not a conglomeration of misfits and troublemakers. Instead, they included both veterans of combat in the Solomons and new replacements from Hawaii. In fact, the only pilot in the squadron with a reputation of being somewhat of a problem child was Boyington himself. So there was really only one black sheep in the bunch, which is oddly more fitting. The aircraft they were assigned were older, many of them in relatively poor condition due to the number of hours they had been in the air. Spare parts were scarce, as was ammunition. Though the pilots themselves were not initially the rogues depicted in legend, they quickly adopted the long-established military tradition of circumventing channels and resorting to barter or outright theft to meet their needs. Boyington fully approved of such methods, though his military superiors did not. It's like, did they even want to win the war? The squadron was equipped with the Vought Corsair, a well-armed gull-wing-equipped fighter which proved to be a match for the Japanese Zero fighters, as well as capable ground support and bomber aircraft. Learning to fly the Corsair proved tricky, as the pilot's seat was situated well behind the nose, causing visibility problems when landing. The Navy decided the Grumman Wildcat and later the Hellcat was a better choice for aircraft carrier operations due to the difficulties encountered when landing. Navy inventories of Corsairs were assigned to the Marines, most of which operated from shore bases. After just a month of preparation, the Black Sheep were ordered to Guadalcanal, and then to the Russell Islands, where they operated from airfields on Munda and Vella La Vella. Their primary mission was to provide aerial cover for Marine and Navy operations and fighter escort for bombing missions against the Japanese strongholds at Rabaul and Truk. They were forced to cannibalize damaged aircraft for parts in order to keep some of the squadron flying, and were not averse to rerouting spare parts originally intended for other groups. Ammunition, fuel, tires, radios, spare parts, and nearly all items necessary to keep a squadron flying were all in short supply during the summer and fall of 1943. Pilots frequently were forced to abandon missions and return to base due to mechanical failures. Yet they persevered, often flying aircraft which were, at least according to standard operating procedures, not airworthy. Pappy never turned back, often flew the least reliable airplane, and inspired his pilots to emulate him. Further compounding issues was the lack of reliable information being fed to Boyington and his men, with maps being, according to Boyington in a later interview, among the worst he'd ever seen in his military career, with him quipping, "Whoever made the maps had either never even been to those places or was more drunk than I was when they sat down to create those worthless objects." During that time, the Black Sheep were credited with destroying 203 Japanese aircraft in the air or on the ground. 9 of its pilots became aces, meaning they had 5 or more confirmed air-to-air victories. Boyington led the way, reaching a total of 26, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker as America's all-time leading ace pilot at the time. He became a national hero, a media darling, and the hard-fisted, hard-drinking, hard-charging American of myth. Barely patient with authority, fearless of the enemy, admired, even idolized by his men. The Black Sheep were lionized in the newspapers, newsreels, and magazines. Pappy, so called because he was more than 10 years older than most of his young pilots, was their undisputed leader. To clarify this, Boyington was only in his 30s at the time, and Karl says, "Feel free to feel old," because he certainly did. In one mission Boyington led, reported at the time and later embellished by subsequent reports on the squadron, he orbited above a large Japanese airbase at Bougainville, daring the Japanese pilots to rise to intercept their Corsairs. More than 60 Japanese fighters were lured into combat, with 20 of them shot down by the 24 Black Sheep. None of the Marines were lost, though several aircraft suffered combat damage. On January 3, 1944, Boyington led the Black Sheep and elements from other Marine squadrons in an action near Rabaul, a Japanese military stronghold on New Guinea. Pappy did not return from the mission. His wingman was shot down and killed, and none of the other pilots involved could report with accuracy what had happened to their leader. An extensive search of the area by air and sea did not reveal any trace of Boyington, nor his airplane. During the Second World War, it was customary for the warring nations to inform their enemies of the status of prisoners of war via the Red Cross. The Japanese did not always follow such courtesies. With no information from any source, the Navy Department listed Boyington as missing in action, or MIA. Such was Boyington's status when he was awarded the Medal of Honor in March 1944. The medal, awarded by President Roosevelt, cited the period of September 12, 1943 to January 3, 1944, and noted his daring and courageous persistence, as well as his personal total of 26 enemy aircraft destroyed. The medal was held in the Navy Department against final knowledge of Boyington's fate. In fact, Boyington was a prisoner of the Japanese. After he was shot down, he was picked up from the sea by a Japanese submarine, transported to Rabaul, and later transferred to Truk, finally being shipped from that base to a prison camp at Aomori, Japan. He spent a total of 20 months in captivity, with the Japanese never according him prisoner of war status. Among the prisoners with whom he was detained were Louis Zamperini, later the subject of the film Unbroken, and Richard O'Kane, former commander of the submarine USS Tang, the most successful American submarine of the war. There were rumors of Boyington being alive during his period of captivity, many reported in newspapers in the United States. He was afforded no mail privileges. Not until August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, did the Japanese acknowledge they held the Marine pilot as a prisoner. Like most prisoners who survived Japanese captivity, Boyington was nearly emaciated when released. Ironically, later in life he claimed that his health improved in captivity, as it was the longest period of sobriety in his adult life he had ever experienced. Boyington also expressed no ill will towards his captors, noting how the Japanese civilians he encountered during his imprisonment treated him with respect, not antipathy. Further noting how many went out of their way to help him and his fellow captives, invariably at great risk to themselves, doing things like slipping him food or, on one occasion, some sake. When reflecting on this years later, Boyington wryly noted how he was treated better by the civilians of the country his comrades were actively bombing than Japanese Americans were treated by their own government, stating bluntly, "I can only feel very ashamed at how we treated our own Japanese Americans, taking their homes and businesses and placing them in camps." Released from captivity, he experienced a burst of fame, enjoying his status as the returning conquering hero. He retrieved his Medal of Honor and was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest award for valor given by the Navy. President Harry Truman bestowed the Navy Cross, in which Boyington was cited for extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the line of his profession. He represented the U.S. Marine Corps in a Victory Bond tour before retiring in 1947 as a full colonel. But he found it difficult to hold a job, resuming his heavy drinking. He married for a second time, a marriage which also ended in divorce. A third marriage, and later a fourth, suffered similar fates. He bounced from job to job, including stints as a brewery manager, which you'd think he would have been great at, a stockbroker, sales jobs for multiple products, and even as a referee for professional wrestling. At times, he even wrestled. None of his jobs lasted long, as heavy drinking and late hours made him unreliable. In 1958, he published his autobiography, which focused on his World War II years, under the title Baa Black Sheep. It was moderately successful. He later wrote a novel, Tanya, which featured espionage affecting the AVG, based on his personal experiences and characters from his time with the Flying Tigers. Gradually, though, he faded into obscurity, known only to World War II buffs and Marine aviators. Speaking of which, in the early 1980s, Boyington was invited to speak at an annual meeting of the Zero Fighter Pilots Association in Japan, a meeting that was attended by the very pilot that had shot him down during World War II. A man whom Boyington held no ill will towards, referring to him as simply another pilot doing his job, and noting in one of the final interviews he ever gave shortly before that trip that he was actually looking forward to meeting the pilot after having exchanged letters with one another about their war exploits. On the matter of the war and whether he held any animosity towards the enemy whatsoever, Boyington was quoted as saying, "This stuff is all gone, and I'd just as soon let it go and forget it." Pappy Boyington received another burst of fame when the television series Baa Black Sheep appeared in the 1970s. The program did not last 2 full seasons, and despite Boyington being credited as a technical advisor, it was panned by critics and by surviving members of the Black Sheep Squadron for being wildly inaccurate. By far, our favorite inaccuracy is that, for some inexplicable reason, Boyington has a pet dog called Meatball. Boyington received some money from the program and survived largely through paid personal appearances and speaking engagements at air shows and conventions. Boyington died from complications from lung cancer in Fresno, California in January 1988. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. In a ceremony conducted in Fresno before his body was flown east, a formation of U.S. Marine fighters from VMA 214, then known as the Black Sheep Squadron, flew by in a salute. Their formation was 1 aircraft short, with one having aborted the mission due to mechanical issues with the plane. But considering Pappy's history, this was perhaps the most fitting tribute of all. I hope you learned something today, and if you dug today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a person from World War II you'd like us to cover. Subscribe to the channel and ring that bell, check out About Us by clicking that link in the pinned comment, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the people who made history happen. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.